In the winter of 8 BCE, the people of Rome gathered in hushed awe as Augustus, their aging but still commanding emperor, crossed the sacred boundary known as the Pomerium. This ritual crossing was no small gesture, it was theater, politics, and religion combined. To cross the Pomerium was to signal a transition, a deliberate act that reminded Rome of the emperor's dual existence, part statesman, part warlord. The Senate awaited him, as it had countless times before, and Augustus once more performed the dance of reluctant power, accepting the renewal of his proconsular imperium as though it were a burden rather than the foundation of his empire. Yet beneath the staged reluctance, Augustus was a man grieving. The death of his stepson Drusus still weighed heavily on him. For Rome, Drusus had been more than a general, he was the embodiment of youthful vigor, a man who had marched deep into Germania, earning loyalty from soldiers and admiration from citizens. To Augustus, Drusus was a bright star extinguished far too soon. In the emperor's long life, a life already extraordinary by Roman standards, longevity came with a cruel tax, the steady disappearance of companions, sons, and trusted allies. Those who had marched with him from the dark days of civil war were now gone or fading, leaving him with heirs who were, in many ways, disappointments. Standing closest to Augustus was Tiberius, his stepson. Stern, withdrawn, and disciplined to the point of harshness, Tiberius seemed reliable but unlikable, a man more feared than admired. Alongside him were Augustus' adopted sons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, still boys in many respects, pampered by privilege, celebrated before they had been tested. They represented promise, but also risk. Rome's future, so carefully built brick by brick, now rested on shoulders unready for the weight. As Augustus addressed the Senate, one could almost hear the silence beneath the words, the silence of absence, the space left by Drusus and the others who had once stood at his side.
Indeed.
In his mind, perhaps, flickered images of Maecenas, the wily advisor who had shaped policy with subtle words, and Agrippa, the brilliant commander who had been his right arm in war and peace. Their deaths had not only stolen friends but pillars of governance. Now, Augustus stood nearly alone, surrounded by faces too young, too unproven, or too indifferent to the empire's burdens. The city, however, still saw glory. Statues of Augustus, white marble gleaming in the winter sun, were everywhere.
The future of Rome.
To the people, their emperor was immortal marble come to life, the man who ended civil wars and brought peace. But in truth, Augustus was already entering the twilight of his reign. The facade of unshakable control hid fractures, succession disputes, restive provinces, and the creeping sense that Rome's victories had sown new seeds of trouble. It is here that history shifts. For what lay ahead was not the conquest of new lands, but the slow testing of Augustus' dynasty against the vastness of his empire. From the forests of Germania to the deserts of Judea, frontier crises would demand commanders, decisions, and sacrifices. And in each case, the question would not be whether Rome could win battles, but whether Augustus' chosen heirs could inherit the burden of empire. The story of these years is not simply about Augustus' glory but about his vulnerability, about the way an empire so vast can rest precariously on the fate of a few individuals. In the Senate chamber that day, the people saw an emperor renewed in his imperium, the master of the known world. What they could not see was how fragile the future had become, nor how every decision, each alliance, each punishment, each gamble, would ripple across the empire's frontiers and determine the survival of his line. Rome had stepped into a new chapter. Augustus was still emperor, but time was eroding his circle of power. And history was waiting, with a cruel patience, to test whether his dynasty was built on marble, or on sand. With the weight of grief still pressing on his shoulders, Augustus turned his gaze northward, to the vast, mist-covered forests beyond the Rhine. Germania had always been a land of shadows to the Romans, dense woodlands that seemed endless, inhabited by tribes who spoke strange tongues and lived by customs alien to Roman order. Yet after Drusus' campaigns, much of Germania had accepted a wary peace with Rome. It was a peace born not out of love for the empire, but out of pragmatism. Rome's legions were heavy, relentless, and they could burn entire villages in a single season. To resist was costly, to yield was, at least temporarily, safer. Tiberius, now the only commander Augustus could rely upon, was dispatched to the Rhine frontier. There, he oversaw a great conference, an extraordinary gathering of envoys from the many tribes Rome had coaxed or coerced into cooperation. For the Romans, such a congress was a display of dominance, emissaries from across the Germanic world standing in deference before the emperor's representative. For the tribes, it was a tense negotiation, a moment where promises of peace mingled with suspicion. But one tribe miscalculated.
Tell me, what's our current
The
position with the
Sicambri,
Germanic
proud and
tribes?
stubborn, arrived late.
Remain restless, my lord.
To them, this might have been a minor slight, a delay in travel or a gesture of independence. To Augustus, it was unforgivable. His patience, already eroded by grief and political isolation, snapped. Without the calming influence of his old Republican allies, men like Agrippa or Maecenas who once soothed his temper, Augustus ordered the Sicambri envoys thrown into chains. Their hostages, held as guarantees of loyalty, were executed. The message was clear: tardiness could be mistaken for treachery, and Rome's mercy had limits. This single act turned negotiation into war. Tiberius marched across the Weser River, leading his legions with cold precision.
Indeed.
The campaign was brutal but efficient. The Sicambri king, Melo, was captured, their resistance crushed. Yet in the aftermath, something remarkable happened. Instead of annihilation, Rome offered settlement. 40,000 Sicambri were uprooted from their ancestral lands and resettled across the Rhine in Belgica. Rome preferred them within reach, where they could be monitored, taxed, and, over time, Romanized. It was punishment, yes, but it was also a strategy of control through absorption. Here, Tiberius showed his strength, not in the glory of battle, but in the logistics of empire. He shifted the forward base from Obereden, deep in hostile country, to Haltern, closer to the Rhine. Supplies could flow more easily, reinforcements could arrive without delay. It was a calculated retreat that was, in fact, a consolidation. A reminder that Rome's strength was not reckless expansion but deliberate, structured endurance. For Augustus, it was a relief. His stepson had shown himself capable, not just as a soldier but as an organizer, the kind of leader who could turn chaos into order. In Rome, Augustus celebrated Tiberius' success. He allowed him to be acclaimed imperator, to ride in triumph through the city, and even designated him consul for the coming year. For a moment, it seemed as though the dynasty had found its anchor, a steady hand to guide Rome's armies at the edge of the known world. And yet, beneath the triumph, shadows lingered. Augustus' fury at the Sicambri revealed a fragility of spirit. Tiberius' triumph masked his growing sense of isolation within the imperial family. The tribes beyond the Rhine had not been defeated in spirit, only momentarily subdued. Rome's hold on Germania remained tenuous, balanced between fear and negotiation. In those quiet winter nights along the Rhine, as soldiers repaired roads and built fortifications, one could sense the truth: Rome's frontier was not secured, only paused. The forest still whispered with resistance, and the tribes still remembered the arrogance of Rome. For now, Augustus could breathe easier, but history does not rest.
Our efforts here.
The Sicambri incident was a lesson that a single rash decision, born of anger, could ignite wars. And it was a foreshadowing of the storms that would one day rise from these very woods to shake the empire itself. The following year unfolded with an unusual quiet, a respite from the blood and fire that had scarred the empire's frontiers. For Augustus, this silence was not emptiness but opportunity. A tranquil year could be transformed into a spectacle of order, a performance of peace. And no emperor understood performance better than Augustus.
Long live Tiberius!
Tiberius, fresh from his triumph over the Sicambri, promised to restore the Temple of Concord. The gesture was layered in meaning. On its surface, it was piety, a vow to dedicate a sacred monument in honor of his late brother Drusus, the golden general whose memory still stirred Rome's heart. But beneath the marble and inscription, it was also politics. To restore concord was to remind the Roman people that unity had triumphed over civil war, that Augustus' dynasty could bind Rome together, even as cracks were widening behind closed doors. The city itself became a stage. Builders and artisans worked under the gaze of senators, equestrians, and commoners alike. In every chiseled line of marble, the Romans saw continuity between their glorious past and their uncertain present. Drusus' name, etched into sacred stone, transformed a dead man into a symbol, a reminder that Rome's dynasty was meant to last beyond the lives of individuals. Most striking of all, however, was Augustus' decision to close the doors of the Temple of Janus.
What do you wish to
This act carried immense symbolic weight. In Rome, the doors of Janus were flung open during war and shut only when the empire was at peace everywhere.
So it is.
Since the founding of the Republic, these doors had been closed only a handful of times, so rare was the absence of conflict. To close them now was to announce to the Roman world that under Augustus' reign, even with simmering unrest and far-flung battles, the empire had achieved peace. Of course, it was more illusion than reality. Trouble always brewed at the edges, whether in Germania, Armenia, or Judea. But Augustus understood that perception was as important as fact. The sight of those doors closed reassured the people that the Pax Romana was not a slogan but a lived reality. In a city where memory of civil war still haunted families, this image mattered more than the truth. Meanwhile, Tiberius basked in honors granted by Augustus. He was acclaimed imperator, the title of victorious commander, alongside his stepfather. He was awarded a triumph, a celebration reserved for Rome's greatest victors, and he was named consul for the coming year. To the people of Rome, it seemed as though Augustus had found his successor, the one man capable of holding the empire together when his own life inevitably waned. And yet, in the shadows of these ceremonies, doubts lingered. Tiberius was not Drusus. He was efficient but cold, capable but uncharismatic. The people cheered his triumph, but their affection was measured, their enthusiasm restrained. They could admire his discipline, but they could not love him. Augustus himself must have felt this unease, even as he lauded Tiberius' accomplishments. The dynasty needed not only strength but charm, not only order but inspiration. And that was something Tiberius lacked. Still, for a moment, Rome breathed as though it had achieved what generations of bloodshed had denied it, peace. Triumphs paraded through the streets, temples gleamed with new dedication, and the doors of Janus, for the third time under Augustus' rule, were sealed shut. It was a fragile peace, perhaps even a staged one, but to the eyes of Rome it glittered like truth. And Augustus, ever the master of appearances, leaned into the illusion, presenting himself not just as a conqueror but as the father of peace, the man who could silence Mars himself. History, however, is never still. Beneath the marble, cracks were forming. The honors heaped on Tiberius would soon collide with family rivalries, personal pride, and a dangerous act of renunciation that no one in Rome could have foreseen. The doors of Janus may have been closed, but they would not remain shut for long. The empire had scarcely finished celebrating Tiberius' triumph when the unexpected happened. Augustus' most trusted general, the man who had just been paraded through Rome as the empire's heir apparent, stunned the political world with a decision that seemed unthinkable. He wished to retire. Not in dignified old age, but in the very prime of his career. It began quietly. Tiberius, who had served faithfully in Rhaetia, Illyricum, and Germania, suddenly requested permission to withdraw from public life. Augustus, who had sacrificed so much to craft a dynasty, was furious. To abandon duty now was, in his eyes, not only a betrayal of the emperor but of Rome itself. Before the Senate, Tiberius' request was made public, and Augustus rejected it outright, his anger plain for all to see. But Tiberius was not a man easily swayed by outrage. In an act that shocked even his enemies, he went on a hunger strike, refusing food for 4 days until Augustus relented. And so, in 6 BCE, Tiberius left Rome, not for a battlefield or governorship, but for self-imposed exile on the Greek island of Rhodes. He was accompanied only by a small retinue, including his personal astrologer, Thrasyllus, a man whose whisperings about fate and destiny may have emboldened Tiberius' decision. Why did he leave? Ancient and modern scholars alike remain puzzled. Some argued that Tiberius resented the favoritism Augustus lavished upon his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, who were groomed as heirs while he, the seasoned commander, was treated as a stopgap. Others whispered that he sought escape from his wife Julia, Augustus' daughter, whose scandalous behavior in Rome was becoming notorious. Still others suggested that Tiberius, cold and weary of politics, simply longed for a life free from the suffocating demands of imperial responsibility. Whatever the truth, the impact was devastating. Augustus was left suddenly without his most capable general. The loss was personal as much as political. With Agrippa dead, Drusus gone, Maecenas buried, and the venerable Taurus failing, Augustus' circle had thinned to shadows. Now Tiberius, too, had slipped away, not by death, but by choice. The emperor, once surrounded by brilliance, found himself nearly alone, forced to look upon his young, untested grandsons and pretend they were ready to inherit a world. In Rhodes, Tiberius lived quietly, fishing, studying philosophy, and walking the marble colonnades that overlooked the Aegean. To some, it seemed like cowardice. To others, like a man seeking peace in a life consumed by war. But in Rome, his absence echoed like an accusation. The empire's strongest soldier had abandoned the legions. Meanwhile, rumors spread like wildfire. Senators speculated whether Augustus had secretly forced Tiberius aside, clearing the path for Gaius and Lucius. Ordinary Romans whispered about Julia's scandals, about astrologers and omens, about betrayal at the heart of the dynasty. In a city addicted to spectacle, Tiberius' departure was more than news, it was a drama, and every Roman had an opinion on why the empire's heir had walked away. For Augustus, this was more than disappointment, it was humiliation. He had raised Tiberius high, given him honors, trusted him with armies, and now, before the eyes of the world, that trust had been discarded. It is said that Augustus, in his private letters, could hardly speak of Tiberius without bitterness. To be left alone, at the moment he needed stability most, must have cut him deeply. But history is cruelly ironic. The man who had walked away from power would one day be dragged back into it, crowned not by choice but by necessity.
Let them understand the gravity
For
of
now,
this decision.
though, the empire had to look
move
elsewhere,
forward,
to youth,
no matter the
to
cost.
inexperience, to heirs barely old enough to wear the toga of manhood. Augustus' dynasty, built with such care, was suddenly balanced on the shoulders of boys. The stage was set for trials that would test not only the empire's borders but the very idea of succession itself. Rome, vast and restless, would not wait for Gaius and Lucius to grow into men. Crises were already stirring in the east, and without Tiberius, Augustus would be forced to gamble the future on hope, ceremony, and the fragile promise of youth. When Tiberius departed for Rhodes, Augustus did not merely lose a general, he lost the one figure in whom competence and experience still resided. It was as if the heart of Rome's command had been hollowed out. The emperor, now in his mid-60s, stood at the apex of empire but with few trusted hands to carry the burden. The city's marble facades gleamed as ever, yet behind them, the machinery of succession groaned under strain. The losses mounted like a cruel tally. Maecenas, the master of diplomacy and subtle counsel, was gone. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the architect of Augustus' naval victories and his partner in governance, had been dead for a decade. Statilius Taurus, one of Rome's most seasoned commanders, was wasting away in age and illness. One by one, the old guard vanished, leaving Augustus in an unfamiliar position, surrounded not by men hardened in civil wars, but by youths barely initiated into manhood. To make matters worse, there was a shortage of qualified leaders even among the wider elite. Augustus had resorted to an unusual measure, shortening the term of the consulship. By rotating men in and out more quickly, he could manufacture a larger pool of ex-consuls to serve as legati, commanders, and administrators. It was a desperate innovation, a sign of how thin Rome's leadership had become in the face of empire's vast demands. The machinery of Roman government needed officers everywhere, in provinces, in legions, in financial offices. Yet Augustus, who had once commanded the loyalty of the greatest talents of his age, now struggled to find men equal to the task. Into this vacuum stepped the grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Still teenagers, they were thrust into roles designed not merely to prepare them, but to reassure Rome that a future existed beyond Augustus. Rituals of youth became ceremonies of state. At 15, Gaius assumed the toga virilis, the garment that marked the passage into Roman manhood. He was granted the title Princeps Juventutis, first of the youth, and given command of one of the 4 termi of equestrian youths. His duties were symbolic, organizing displays of horsemanship, leading the cavalry procession known as the Trenavectio Equitum. Yet beneath the pageantry lay the hope that Gaius was being quietly trained for leadership, learning logistics, discipline, and command in miniature. Lucius, younger but equally favored, followed in his brother's steps. He too was elevated in ceremony, named Princeps Juventutis, and initiated into the priesthood as an augur. Together, the brothers were paraded before the Roman people not as children but as heirs. Augustus staged these events carefully, ensuring that every ritual became a signal, the dynasty was secure, Rome's future embodied in these 2 bright young men. But reality was harsher. Neither Gaius nor Lucius had commanded armies, nor had they faced the storms of politics. Their honors were crowns without substance, their titles scaffolding erected around inexperience. The Senate might applaud, the people might cheer, but everyone knew these boys were not yet ready to shoulder the burden of empire. The memory of Drusus, charismatic, proven, beloved by the legions, still loomed like a ghost, a reminder of what Rome had lost and what these heirs were not. Augustus, ever the master of appearances, leaned heavily on spectacle. When the youths rode in public, the city was filled with banners and flowers. When they were named to priesthoods, sacrifices were offered, games held. These moments reassured the masses but did little to comfort Augustus in private. He knew too well that the world beyond Rome would not wait for boys to grow into men. Already, unrest flickered in the east. In Armenia and Judea, the delicate balance of kings and client rulers was unraveling. Bandits, claimants, and Parthian intrigue threatened to destabilize entire provinces. Rome's enemies did not care for rituals of manhood or closed doors of Janus, they recognized only the presence or absence of power. And in those years, Rome's power was stretched thin. Thus Augustus' shortage of men became more than a personal grief, it became a strategic crisis. The empire had never been larger, never more demanding, and yet its leadership pool was at its weakest. On the surface, Rome glittered with order and marble grandeur. But beneath, a truth gnawed, the dynasty was fragile, the heirs untested, and the empire hungry for soldiers who no longer existed. And soon, a spark would ignite in Judea, where a king's death and a treasure of gold would turn the emperor's shortage of men into a test of survival. While Augustus tightened his grip on Rome through ceremony and symbolism, the eastern provinces stirred restlessly. Unlike the forests of Germania, where Rome faced warriors bound by kin and clan, the east presented a far more delicate problem, kingdoms whose loyalty was purchased, not conquered, and whose wealth could both enrich and destabilize the empire. In Galatia and Pamphylia, Publius Sulpicius Quirinius, a seasoned administrator and soldier, was tasked with stamping out rampant banditry. These were not mere thieves but organized war bands, exploiting rugged mountains and fractured local politics to challenge Roman authority. Quirinius' campaign was successful, an important but easily overlooked detail in the larger sweep of history. Yet it foreshadowed the constant Roman struggle in the east, not just fighting foreign armies, but controlling the shifting sands of local power. More consequential was the figure of Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Syria. A man with a reputation for severity, Varus was well known even to later generations for a disaster yet to come. But here, in the years before that calamity, he was already embroiled in crises. For in 4 BCE, one of Rome's most important allies, Herod the Great, king of Judea, died. Herod had been, in many ways, the perfect client king. He rebuilt cities, funded temples, and, above all, ensured that Judea remained loyal to Rome. His reign was marked by both cruelty and brilliance. He executed rivals, even members of his own family, but he also expanded Jerusalem's Second Temple into a marvel of the ancient world. To Augustus, Herod was invaluable, a monarch ruthless enough to control his people, yet pragmatic enough to keep Rome's interests at the center of his rule. But Herod's death fractured the fragile peace. His will divided power among his sons, but it also left vast sums of money, stored in palaces and temples, bequeathed to Augustus and the Roman state. To the Romans, this was tribute, the natural reward of overlordship. To the people of Judea and the surrounding lands, it was nothing less than theft. Gold consecrated to the temple of their god, wealth accumulated in their land, was now to be carried off to Rome's coffers. The new tetrarch Archelaus found himself immediately confronted by unrest. It was Passover, a festival that already swelled Jerusalem with crowds. Pilgrims from across the land gathered in the holy city, and whispers of Roman greed inflamed the air. Demonstrators filled the streets, chanting, demanding relief from the heavy hand of taxation and foreign interference. Archelaus tried the cautious path at first. He sent a Roman tribune with a small auxiliary cohort to disperse the crowds without bloodshed. But the crowd was not cowed. Stones rained down on the soldiers, killing them in the streets. The tribune fled, Archelaus alongside him, humiliated and alarmed. Soon after, Archelaus returned, this time not with patience but with steel. He led his army against the gathered pilgrims, cutting them down within the city. Thousands perished during what was meant to be a festival of faith. Blood flowed where prayers had been raised. This massacre temporarily stilled the uprising, but it burned resentment deep into the hearts of Judea's people. Even worse, the Roman procurator Sabinus, dispatched from Syria, arrived with his own agenda. Where Varus urged caution, Sabinus pressed toward profit. He made no secret of his desire to seize Herod's treasure for Augustus, and he began prying open the treasuries of Jerusalem. To the people, this was sacrilege made flesh, Romans looting the wealth of their God's temple. The city, already raw with grief and anger, erupted once more. Rioters stormed the streets. Tension escalated into pitched battles around the temple itself, where Roman soldiers clashed with citizens determined to defend what was sacred. Flames licked at the surrounding buildings. Smoke blackened the sky over Jerusalem. For the first time since Pompey's conquest more than 60 years earlier, the Holy City was a battlefield against Rome itself. The fragile balance Herod had maintained collapsed in an instant. Augustus' shortage of seasoned commanders now carried a deadly cost. Instead of calming the east, Rome's agents inflamed it. And as the fires of revolt spread beyond Jerusalem, Augustus' grandsons, still children playing at leadership in Rome, were powerless to respond. It would fall, once again, to Varus and his legions to march into the storm. The Passover that followed Herod's death should have been a season of solemn worship, a celebration that bound families and tribes together in memory of deliverance. Instead, it became the spark of one of the fiercest urban confrontations in Judea's history. Herod Archelaus, newly installed as tetrarch, walked a knife's edge. His father's throne was still warm, his legitimacy fragile, and his subjects restless. The people did not merely mourn Herod's death, they raged against what they saw as Rome's grasping hand taking the treasures of their God. Gold that had been consecrated, wealth that had been stored in Jerusalem's holiest places, was now rumored to be on its way to Augustus' coffers. The insult cut deeper than taxation, it was sacrilege. When Archelaus attempted moderation, sending Roman auxiliaries to pacify the crowd, it ended in humiliation. Stones flew, soldiers fell, and Archelaus himself barely escaped with his life. This failure destroyed any illusion of control. Returning with his army, Archelaus unleashed brutality upon the festival-goers. What began as protest ended in massacre. Blood pooled on the stones where pilgrims had gathered to sing hymns. A holy feast turned into a funeral pyre. But even this was not the worst. Into this tinderbox stepped Sabinus, the Roman procurator of Syria, a man whose ambition far outweighed his caution. Unlike Varus, who understood that Judea was a cauldron ready to boil over, Sabinus seemed determined to seize Herod's legacy by force. He ignored warnings, storming into Jerusalem with the intent of prying open the king's treasuries. In Sabinus' eyes, the wealth was Augustus by right. In the eyes of the people, it was desecration. The streets erupted once more, this time not in scattered riots but in full-scale revolt. Citizens, pilgrims, even defectors from Archelaus' own army poured into the city. The temple itself became the center of battle. From its upper courts, rebels hurled stones and javelins down on the Romans. Flames licked across nearby buildings, spreading smoke through the sacred precincts. Within the temple's walls, cries of prayer mingled with screams of battle. Sabinus, arrogant even in crisis, directed his men from one of the city's great towers, ordering volleys against the masses.
The situation is dire.
Roman steel cut through unarmed pilgrims, arrows flew into the crowds. But the defenders, desperate and enraged, adapted. They used the temple's high ground, turning sacred architecture into fortress walls. Fire consumed Roman positions. Soldiers who had taken shelter in nearby buildings were trapped and burned alive. Soon the Romans themselves were besieged. Sabinus, Archelaus loyalists, and a corps of Roman troops were surrounded inside Jerusalem, hemmed in by a city united in rebellion. Supplies dwindled, morale cracked, and the defenders sent frantic messengers northward. They called for Varus, governor of Syria, to bring reinforcements before the revolt consumed not just Jerusalem but the whole province. Outside the walls, the rebellion spread like wildfire. In Idumea, 2,000 of Herod's veterans rallied under old banners, attacking Archelaus loyalists. In Galilee, a bandit's son, Judas of Sepphoris, broke into the royal armory, seizing weapons and leading raids against Roman positions. In Perea and Emmaus, charismatic leaders like Simon and Athronges rose up, each proclaiming themselves rightful kings. The land of Judea had fractured into chaos. Each faction carried its own grievance, some against Rome, others against Herod's dynasty, still others driven by ambition or desperation. Yet together, they posed a single, terrifying truth: the Roman hold on Judea was slipping. What had begun as a festival protest had become a full-scale uprising. For Augustus, hundreds of miles away in Rome, such details would have arrived in fragments: panicked letters, reports of cities aflame, legions under siege. But on the ground, for men like Varus, the reality was immediate. Judea, the linchpin of Rome's client kingdoms in the east, was burning. And if it were lost, the flames might spread to Syria, to Galilee, perhaps even inviting Parthian intervention. The empire could not afford to let that happen. And so Varus prepared to march, bringing with him the cold, merciless discipline of Rome's legions to stamp out the fire of revolt. The message from Jerusalem reached Varus like a thunderclap. His legate Sabinus was trapped inside the city, Archelaus' rule was unraveling, and the countryside was in flames. For Rome, Judea was too strategic to be lost. It was the gateway between Egypt's grain and Syria's riches, a hinge upon which eastern security rested. Delay meant disaster. Varus acted swiftly. He rallied his legions in Syria, 2 full formations hardened by frontier service, supported by 4 aeli of cavalry. Along the way, he gathered reinforcements, some 1,500 veterans who re-enlisted voluntarily, men too old for glory but unwilling to see Rome humiliated. From the desert, an Arabian force under King Aretas joined the march, eager to avenge old grievances against the Judeans. With this formidable host, Varus advanced southward, the iron weight of empire pressing into the hills of Judea. The campaign was ruthless. On the road to Jerusalem, Varus ordered swift punishments to break resistance before it could gather. At Sepphoris, where Judas of Sepphoris had seized the armory, Varus sent his commander Gaius with orders to raze the city. It was reduced to ash, the rebels cut down without mercy. At Sampho, Arabian allies burned villages in reprisal, killing indiscriminately. At Emmaus, when Athronges' rebellion faltered, the settlement was torched as a warning to others. When Varus finally reached Jerusalem, the rebels melted away into the hills, unwilling to face legions head-on. Sabinus and the besieged Romans were relieved. Order, at least in the city, was restored. But Varus did not stop there. Determined to crush resistance decisively, he gathered thousands of captives. Most he spared, declaring clemency in Augustus' name, but upon 2,000 of the most defiant, he enacted Rome's harshest punishment. They were nailed to crosses along the roads of Judea, their bodies left hanging in the sun, a grim warning to any who might dream of further rebellion. It was terror as policy. Crucifixion was no ordinary execution, it was a statement. To see thousands of bodies lining the roads was to understand that Rome did not merely kill its enemies, it obliterated their memory, making their suffering into a monument of obedience. To the Roman mind, this was justice. To the people of Judea, it was desecration upon desecration, a brutality that deepened wounds rather than healed them. Varus' allies, the Arabians under Aretas, proved equally troublesome. Their vendetta against the Judeans quickly degenerated into private plunder. Villages were burned not as strategy but as revenge. Families who had once been Rome's cautious allies now bled under Arabian reprisals carried out under Roman banners. Varus, recognizing the danger of letting allies become predators, recalled Aretas' men.
Supplies have not arrived.
But the damage was done. Resentment against Rome was no longer confined to zealots or rebels, it now spread among ordinary villagers whose only crime was to be caught between foreign swords. Yet even in his severity, Varus knew when to temper steel with diplomacy. He announced a general amnesty for most rebels, sparing the multitudes while sending only the leaders to Augustus in Rome for trial. The emperor, in a rare gesture of clemency, pardoned nearly all but members of Herod's family. It was an attempt to show that Rome punished revolt but did not seek annihilation. Still, the memory of 2,000 crosses could not be erased. For the moment, the province was quiet. Villages smoldered, Jerusalem was subdued, and Sabinus returned humiliated but alive. Varus marched back to Antioch, leaving garrisons in place. On the surface, order had been restored. But beneath that order lay bitterness, grief, and a thirst for vengeance that would echo through Judea for generations. It is easy to see this episode as one of Rome's many routine suppressions, another frontier crisis handled with a mixture of terror and diplomacy. But in retrospect, the revolt of 4 BCE was a signal. It revealed just how fragile Rome's system of client kings and procurators truly was, how quickly loyalty could collapse when religion and treasure collided. Judea was not Germania, it could not be pacified by relocation or brute force alone. Here, faith ran deeper than fear, and each act of Roman cruelty became fuel for future flames. Augustus, far away in Rome, read the reports of Varus' success with relief. But history remembers not just the peace regained, but the method by which it was secured, a forest of crosses in the Judean sun. The empire was safe for now, but its foundation in the east had cracked. And soon, the weight of succession politics in Rome would collide with the growing storm at its frontiers. In the aftermath of bloodshed in Judea, Augustus seized upon something Rome desperately needed, the image of stability. In 2 BCE, the Senate, led by Valerius Messala, bestowed upon him the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. The honor was more than ceremonial. It declared Augustus not only the ruler of Rome but its symbolic patriarch, the man whose guardianship stretched over every family, every soldier, every city. For a man who had clawed his way to power through civil war, this was a remarkable transformation, from destroyer of the republic to father of a nation. The accolade came at a time when Augustus was also securing his dynasty's public face. Gaius Caesar, his eldest grandson, had already taken his first steps into manhood. Now it was Lucius' turn. At just 14, he too donned a toga virilis, was named Princeps Juventutis, and even initiated as an augur, a priestly office that linked him to Rome's sacred traditions. The brothers, though still boys, now stood before the Roman people not as children of privilege but as heirs apparent. The timing was perfect for Augustus' most ambitious architectural project, the dedication of the Forum Augusti. Rising behind the Capitoline, it was a space designed to dwarf memory itself. At its heart stood the gleaming temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, a god chosen not just for his martial power but for his symbolism. Mars Ultor commemorated vengeance for Julius Caesar's assassination, transforming personal tragedy into state religion. Augustus had promised the temple decades earlier, at Philippi, where he and Agrippa had avenged Caesar by crushing Brutus and Cassius. Now, at last, the promise stood in marble, its columns towering, its statues chronicling Rome's mythic past. The dedication was spectacle on a scale that only Augustus could orchestrate. He and his grandsons presided over the ceremonies. Animal sacrifices smoked at the altars, priests chanted, the temple doors opened to reveal military standards recovered from Parthia years earlier, a visible reminder of Rome's supremacy and Augustus' diplomacy. This was not just religion, it was propaganda made stone. And the games that followed were designed to leave the city breathless. In the Circus Flaminius, citizens cheered as gladiators clashed, as exotic beasts from Africa were hunted in the arena, and as a mock naval battle turned the amphitheater into a lake of blood and spray. For ordinary Romans, it was entertainment on an unimaginable scale. For Augustus, it was theater with a purpose. Every game, every display reminded the masses that their emperor was both protector and provider, that the dynasty was secure, and that Rome's destiny was bound to his bloodline. Yet not all eyes were convinced. The pageantry of Gaius and Lucius was impressive, but it could not conceal their inexperience. Cassius Dio, writing a century later, was blunt in his judgment. Gaius learned little more than how to delegate responsibility. He commanded in name, not in deed. Behind the grandeur of ceremonies and titles, the cracks in Augustus' succession plan were already showing. And while the people reveled in games and shouted praises to their pater patriae, Augustus must have felt the unease privately. He had spent decades building an empire, balancing provinces, suppressing revolts, securing borders. Yet succession was a war he could not win with legions. It depended on the character of young men still untested by hardship. Still, the illusion of security mattered. With his grandsons at his side, with Mars Ultor towering behind him, and with the Senate calling him father of the fatherland, Augustus appeared invincible. Rome, dazzled by marble and ceremony, believed that the empire stood on unshakable foundations. But history has a way of testing illusions. And as tensions with Parthia rose once more, Augustus would soon be forced to send one of those beloved grandsons eastward, not to a parade, but to war. The Roman world never rested long. Even as Augustus basked in the glory of his new title, Pater Patriae, trouble brewed on the empire's eastern horizon. Armenia, that perennial buffer between Rome and Parthia, had once again become the fault line of great power rivalry. The death of Artavasdes III left a vacuum, and into that void stepped Parthian influence. Tigranes IV, a monarch backed by Parthian support, now sat on the Armenian throne. For Augustus, this was more than a dynastic shuffle, it was an insult, a direct challenge to Rome's supremacy in the east. Diplomatic letters crossed the Euphrates. From Parthia's king, Phraates's, came polite but barbed correspondence, filled with veiled slights and insinuations. From Augustus came equally sharp replies, crafted to humiliate without admitting weakness. These exchanges, preserved in fragments, read less like negotiations and more like a duel fought with words instead of swords. To the Romans, diplomacy was war by other means, and Augustus, though too old to campaign in person, wielded rhetoric with lethal precision. But diplomacy alone could not settle Armenia. Augustus needed a king who could balance loyalty to Rome with acceptance among the Armenians themselves. The problem was that no such figure existed. The Parthians promoted Tigranes IV, their client. Augustus countered by considering another candidate, Artabatzos, a hostage-turned-ally who had lived under Roman watch. Before the matter could be resolved, fate intervened. Artabatzos died suddenly, leaving Augustus scrambling for alternatives. It was then that a surprising opportunity arose. Tigranes, once Parthia's man, petitioned Augustus himself for recognition.
We must be discreet.
Perhaps he saw Rome as the stronger patron, or perhaps he sought to play both sides. Whatever his motives, Augustus seized the moment. Tigranes was ferried off to Armenia with Roman blessing, presented as a king not by Parthian favor but by Roman decree. It was a victory on paper, proof that Augustus could still sway thrones without drawing a sword. Yet even here, shadows lingered. Marcus Lollius, one of Augustus' trusted advisors, was suddenly revealed as a traitor. Exposed by Phratis himself, Lollius' duplicity shook Augustus deeply. To betray secrets to the enemy was no ordinary crime, it was treason at the very heart of imperial policy. Lollius chose suicide over trial, a grim end that underscored how precarious even Augustus' inner circle had become. Still, the emperor pressed forward. He needed to strengthen his dynasty's presence on the frontier, to show Rome and Parthia alike that the next generation could stand in his place. And so Gaius Caesar, still barely more than a youth, was thrust into the spotlight.
We must discuss terms.
The Senate voted to grant him proconsular imperium, despite his age. He was appointed consul designate for the following year, another leap over tradition. To bolster his inexperience, Augustus assigned veterans of command, Quirinius, Marcus Lollius before his disgrace, and the Praetorian officer Lucius Aelius Cyanus, as guides and protectors. It was a gamble. Gaius was untested, charismatic but unproven. Yet Augustus had little choice. With Tiberius in self-imposed exile and the old guard gone, the burden of empire fell on boys made men by decree, not by battle. The East was not forgiving, and Armenia least of all. Thus began a new round of the great chess match between Rome and Parthia. Kings were pawns, letters were weapons, and Augustus' legacy was the prize. To the Roman people, this seemed a triumph of diplomacy. To Augustus himself, it was a reminder that the empire's survival now depended not on his hand, but on the fragile abilities of his heirs. And soon, those heirs would be tested not in letters or ceremonies, but under the walls of an Armenian fortress where steel, not words, decided the future. The uneasy truce Augustus had tried to weave in Armenia unraveled almost as soon as it was stitched together. Tigranes IV, briefly buoyed by Roman recognition, was struck down in sudden death, some said by accident, others whispered by design, Parthian daggers moving unseen. The throne was again empty, and Augustus' fragile balance shattered. Into the vacuum stepped Ariobarzanes II, Rome's nominee, but his coronation was met with bitter hostility. The Armenians, ever resistant to being pawns in the games of empires, rose in revolt. For Gaius Caesar, Augustus' beloved grandson, this was his trial by fire. Barely out of youth, he now bore the full weight of Roman command. Proclaimed Orienti Prepositus, he led legions eastward across the Euphrates, banners gleaming in the sun. At his side marched hardened veterans, men who had served under Agrippa and Tiberius, who now measured this young heir with skeptical eyes. The target of their advance was the city of Artagira, a stronghold perched in the Armenian highlands. Its commander, known variously as Adon or Dons in the tangled accounts of Roman historians, was loyal either to Parthia or to Armenia's old order. Sources conflict, as they so often do when truth is muddied by politics and propaganda. What is certain is that he refused to yield. Behind his walls, he and his garrison defied Gaius, trusting the mountains and winter to wear down the Romans. And so began the siege. Roman camps sprouted like iron teeth around the city. Siege works rose, towers were rolled forward, trenches were dug. Winter's breath froze the earth, yet the legions endured, their discipline unbroken. Fires lit the night sky, the glow of furnaces forging weapons under the snow-dusted peaks. For Gaius, the siege was both a proving ground and a crucible. But then came the moment of betrayal, or negotiation, depending on which source one believes. Adon, perhaps seeking terms, invited Gaius into parley. The young heir, eager to end the stalemate, agreed. Accounts diverge. Some say Adon feigned surrender, only to treacherously wound Gaius in the midst of talks. Others claim Gaius pressed too close and was struck in the chaos of skirmish. However it happened, the result was the same. Rome's heir staggered back from the parley, bleeding, his body pierced and his future suddenly uncertain. The wound was not immediately fatal, but it festered. Infection in those days was a slow, merciless killer. Gaius, once radiant with promise, began to weaken. Yet the siege dragged on. The legions, fueled by fury at their commander's injury, pressed harder. Artagira was stormed. Its walls were toppled stone by stone, its defenses pulled down so that it could never again rise against Rome. Adon vanished from history. Some said he fell on his sword, others that he was burned alive on a pyre. To the victors, his fate mattered less than the message: resistance to Rome would end in ruin. But the triumph was hollow. The Romans had taken the city, yes, but their heir was wounded, and whispers of his frailty spread through the camp. Soldiers who had once cheered Gaius now muttered anxiously around campfires, wondering if Augustus' chosen successor had the strength to endure. Back in Rome, news arrived in fragments: victory proclaimed, Gaius hailed as imperator for his success. Yet Augustus must have read between the lines. He knew how words could gild disaster. Behind the proclamations of triumph lay the truth: his heir had been bloodied, his body broken, his destiny hanging by a thread. The siege of Artagira had ended in Roman victory, but it was a victory poisoned by doubt. The empire had gained a fortress, yet perhaps lost its future. When Artagira finally fell, it was less a triumph than an exorcism. Roman soldiers tore down its walls stone by stone, ensuring that the city could never again resist their siege engines. Smoke curled over the Armenian highlands as the legions dismantled not just a stronghold, but a symbol of defiance. For a moment, it seemed Augustus' gamble had paid off. Armenia was subdued, Ariobarzanes II installed as Rome's puppet king, and Gaius Caesar hailed as imperator by decree of the Senate. But Armenia was a graveyard for certainty. Ariobarzanes II soon died, cut down not by sword but by the frailty of mortality. His reign had lasted scarcely long enough to plant roots, and with his death the throne wobbled once more. Augustus quickly pushed forward another nominee, Artabatzos, a younger candidate groomed under Roman oversight. He too was crowned, another pawn in the endless contest between Rome and Parthia. Yet the speed with which kings rose and fell revealed the reality: Rome could impose rulers, but it could not impose loyalty. Armenian nobles accepted these appointments outwardly, but in their hearts they simmered with resentment. For Gaius Caesar, the fall of Artagira should have been his crowning achievement. Instead, it was the beginning of decline. His wound, sustained during the parley with Adon, never truly healed. In the harsh winter encampments, infection lingered, his strength sapped day by day. He returned to his command pale and diminished, a shadow of the eager youth who had once ridden at the head of the legions. Soldiers still cheered him in public, but privately they exchanged worried glances. Their young general was wasting away. Augustus, far away in Rome, must have felt the chill of dread in every dispatch. He had invested the empire's hopes in these boys, first Lucius, now Gaius. Yet Armenia had exposed how fragile those hopes were. Titles, honors, and ceremonies could not protect flesh from steel, nor ambition from fate. The grandsons he had paraded before the Roman people as heirs of empire were proving as mortal as any soldier on the frontier. And still, the empire demanded heirs. Rome's system of succession was not a law but a performance, an ongoing illusion that power would pass smoothly from one pair of hands to another. But the more Augustus tried to stage-manage destiny, the more unstable it became.
Grant us strength.
Drusus had died, Lucius was still untested, and now Gaius, wounded, fevered, and faltering, seemed unlikely to fulfill the role Augustus had so carefully crafted. It was as though the dynasty was being built on sand foundations. Each time Augustus erected a pillar of succession, time or fate swept it away. The eastern frontier might appear pacified on a map, but the cost was gnawing away at the very heart of imperial continuity. In Rome, the people saw only the outward symbols, the titles of imperator conferred on Gaius, the celebration of victory, the dedication of temples. But behind the facade, Augustus was forced to reckon with a harsher truth. Empire could be managed by ceremony, but succession could not. Armenia had been won, but at what price? As the winter snows melted in the highlands, the empire stood at a crossroads. Augustus' legacy was secured in marble, in laws, in monuments, but not in flesh. The heirs he relied upon were proving fragile, and without them, all the grandeur of the Pax Romana could collapse in a single generation. The sack of Artagira ended one revolt, but it opened another, more insidious conflict, the war against time, mortality, and the uncertainty of inheritance. And in that war, Augustus was losing. The promise of Augustus' dynasty, already fragile, now faced its cruelest blow. In 2 CE, Lucius Caesar, the younger of the two golden heirs, set out for his first military posting in Hispania. It was meant to be the beginning of a career, the kind of formative service that could temper ceremony into real command. Yet destiny intervened before he ever reached the frontier. At Massilia, along the southern coast of Gaul, Lucius fell ill.
Gaius is fading.
Within days, he was dead. He was not yet 20. The news stunned Rome. Augustus, who had raised Lucius before the eyes of the people with such care, was forced to preside over a funeral instead of a triumph. The city mourned not only the boy but the hope he embodied, the continuity of empire made flesh. His ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Augustus, the grand tomb by the Tiber that was meant to house emperors and their kin, now filling too quickly with the young. For a brief moment, Augustus' hope rested entirely on Gaius. But the victory at Artagira had left him wounded in body and, perhaps, in spirit. The infection from his injury lingered.
We acknowledge your concern.
Fever came in waves, leaving him delirious, weakened. His letters to Augustus grew more desperate, pleading to be released from public life, to retire as Tiberius once had. In one of his last acts of grace, Augustus allowed it. But it was too late. As Gaius made his way back westward, his health collapsed. In 4 CE, at Limera in Lycia, far from Rome and far from the glory he had been promised, Gaius died. He was 23. His body was carried back across the sea, mourned by soldiers who had followed him with more loyalty than confidence. When his ashes reached Rome, they were placed beside his brothers in the mausoleum. Two boys, once paraded as heirs of empire, now lay silent in the same tomb, their silver-gilt spears and shields displayed in the Curia Julia as symbols of promise unfulfilled.
Conditions of succession.
The grief in Rome was heavy, but in Augustus it must have been unbearable. He had outlived nearly every man he had trusted, nearly every heir he had prepared. Agrippa was gone, Drusus was gone, Lucius gone, now Gaius gone. The mausoleum, built to house his dynasty in eternity, was becoming a monument to disappointment. And yet the empire could not stop for mourning. Augustus could not collapse into grief, no matter how heavy it pressed upon him. Rome demanded leadership, demanded continuity, demanded that the emperor solve the question that had haunted his reign for decades: who would inherit the burden of the world? The deaths of Lucius and Gaius left Augustus with little choice. He turned again to the man who had abandoned him once before, Tiberius. It was not love that drew him back, nor admiration.
Take you, Tiberius,
it was necessity.
as my rightful son.
Augustus could no longer gamble on boys. He needed a man hardened by war, even if he was unloved by the people and resented within his own family. The deaths of the brothers closed one chapter of the Julio-Claudian story and opened another.
Are duly recorded.
The dynasty that had been carefully staged as a family of bright heirs was now reduced to ashes, literally. Rome's future, once envisioned as youthful, radiant, and secure, was instead forced back into the hands of a reluctant, grim soldier. In the mausoleum, the urns of Lucius and Gaius gleamed in the torchlight, their names carved in stone. To Augustus, they must have been more than monuments, they were warnings. Time, that most merciless enemy, was consuming his house from within. And Rome, though it mourned, did not slow. The empire pressed onward, its fate once more resting in fragile human hands. The deaths of Lucius and Gaius forced Augustus into a corner. The dynasty he had dreamed of, sculpted with such precision, was collapsing like a mosaic missing too many tiles. He could no longer pretend that youth and ceremony would secure Rome's future. If the empire was to endure, he needed a proven soldier, a man tested by war and capable of command. And so, reluctantly, Augustus turned back to the one figure who remained, Tiberius. Tiberius' exile on Rhodes had been an open wound between him and Augustus. The emperor had never forgiven his withdrawal, his apparent desertion of duty at the very moment Rome needed him most. Yet necessity now outweighed resentment. In 4 CE, Augustus formally adopted Tiberius as his son and heir. The ceremony was not one of affection but of strategy, an adoption forged in politics rather than in love. But Augustus did not stop there. His faith in Tiberius was limited, his distrust still palpable. And so he bound the adoption with a condition: Tiberius, upon becoming heir, must in turn adopt Germanicus, his own nephew. Germanicus was young, charismatic, and beloved by the people in ways Tiberius never was. He carried the blood of both Julian and Claudian lines, linking Augustus' heritage with that of Tiberius' family. It was a clever safeguard: if Tiberius faltered, Germanicus could be the future. Augustus was building not a single succession, but a chain. For Tiberius, the adoption was both vindication and humiliation. Vindication because he was once again at the heart of empire, heir to Augustus himself. Humiliation because his position was hedged, conditional, and watched closely by Augustus' suspicious eye. He was not trusted fully, and the public knew it. Still, the act marked Tiberius' re-entry into Rome's political life.
I accept this trust.
He returned from Rhodes, his tribunicia potestas restored, his authority renewed. In the Senate, he was formally confirmed as Augustus' partner in rule. The people of Rome, who had once whispered of his withdrawal in
route
scorn,
ahead is secure,
now
my
watched him
lord.
take the stage again.
We've marked the safest
To some,
passages.
he was a savior returning. To others, a shadow replacing the golden heirs who had died too soon. Augustus, though aged and weary, could not pause.
We offer these hostages.
His dynasty had
and
been
our
battered,
solemn oaths.
but it was not broken. By binding Tiberius to Germanicus, he believed he had found a solution to Rome's greatest vulnerability. The succession was no longer a matter of single lives, so easily extinguished. It was a system of contingencies, a network of heirs designed to withstand the cruelty of fate. Yet beneath the strategy lay the same uncertainty that had haunted Augustus for years. He had built Rome's empire with iron and marble, but succession remained built on fragile flesh. Tiberius, dour and unloved, was now the keystone of the imperial arch. Germanicus, brilliant but untested, was the promise of a brighter
The
future.
goddess smiles upon
Together
our
they formed a precarious
The
balance.
harvest will be bountiful this year.
For Rome, the adoption was reassurance. The people saw continuity, a clear heir, a next generation waiting in the wings. For Augustus, it was necessity disguised as certainty. He had seen too many heirs lowered into the mausoleum to believe in permanence. This time, he had crafted a safety net. But whether it would hold was a question only time could answer. And time, as Augustus knew too well, was running out. Tiberius' return from Rhodes was not met with feasting and laurels alone. The empire had no luxury for leisure. Trouble was stirring once more on the northern frontier. Germania, that dark and tangled wilderness beyond the Rhine, had never been pacified in truth, only managed, coaxed, and threatened into uneasy compliance. Now, with Augustus' succession anxieties momentarily resolved, the task of securing the frontier fell once more to Tiberius. The veterans who had served
Orders
under
for the
him years
northern
before
legions.
greeted his arrival with loyalty. Hardened
gods
men,
grant us
scarred
safe
by years of
passage.
marching through mud and snow, hailed his return with
We
genuine
pray for our
affection.
safe return.
They remembered his discipline, his precision, his refusal to waste lives for glory. Unlike Drusus, whose charisma had won hearts, Tiberius inspired respect through severity. To the veterans, he was the one commander who could be trusted to bring them home alive. In 4 CE, Tiberius launched an aggressive campaign into Germania. Following the old trail blazed by Drusus in 12 BCE, he crossed the Weser, striking deep into tribal lands. The Cananophates, the Bructeri, the Achuari, and even the Cherusei, the very tribe that would one day destroy Varus, were subdued by his methodical advance. He reached the headwaters of the Lip and established a new legionary fortress at Anrepen, a base from which supplies could be funneled and operations extended deeper into the forests. What set Tiberius apart was not brilliance in battle but mastery of logistics. He knew that Germania could not be conquered in a single sweeping strike. It had to be ground down, step by step, road by road. He drove his men relentlessly, building fortifications, securing river crossings, ensuring that each campaign season ended with firm gains. For the tribes, his advance felt like a tightening noose. For Rome, it was proof that Tiberius, though unloved in the capital, was indispensable in the field. The following year, 5 CE, he pressed further still. Crossing the Elbe, an achievement that even Drusus had not managed, Tiberius subdued tribe after tribe, the Chauci, the Langobardi, the Semnones, the Hermunduri. He established new outposts at Markbright and Carnuntum, laying the groundwork for deeper Roman penetration. The campaign pushed the boundaries of Roman influence further east than ever before, hinting at the possibility of a Germania fully under Rome's yoke. Winter did not halt him. Unlike other commanders who retreated to
20
safety at the
shekels for
first
this
snow,
finest amphorae.
Tiberius extended his campaigns deep into the cold months,
These are worth 50.
His armies endured frost, hunger, and ceaseless marches, but they held together. Where others sought glory in set-piece battles, Tiberius pursued attrition, slow, patient, grinding pressure until resistance collapsed. By the close of 5 CE, Germania seemed more pacified than ever before. The tribes bent, if not in spirit, at least in submission. Rome's frontier stretched further than it had under any previous emperor. For Augustus, the reports were a bomb. At last, he had proof that Tiberius could be both heir and commander, the man capable of carrying the empire's burdens when Augustus himself could no longer bear them. And yet, even in triumph, the seeds of disaster were sown. The deeper Rome pushed into Germania, the more it depended on roads through hostile forests, on alliances with fickle tribes, on fortresses isolated in seas of resistance. Tiberius' methodical brilliance brought short-term stability, but it was stability balanced on a knife's edge. For the moment, though, the emperor could rest. His heir was back, his legions victorious, and Germania subdued, at least for now. Augustus' twilight years, however, would not remain so calm. For even as Tiberius triumphed in the north, storms were gathering elsewhere, in provinces far closer to Rome's heart. The campaigns of Tiberius had pushed Rome's shadow further into Germania than ever before. Yet conquest in those lands was never a matter of swords alone. Rome's true weapon was transformation, taking wild landscapes and weaving them into the fabric of empire. Roads were cut through forests, bridging rivers with stone and timber. Fortresses became settlements, outposts turned into trading hubs. Markets sprouted where none had stood before, filled with Roman goods, amphorae of wine, fine pottery, coins stamped with Augustus' image. For a time, it seemed as though the Germanic tribes were being drawn into Rome's orbit not just by force but by commerce.
Consider our true strength.
Chiefs arrived at Roman markets with furs, livestock, and amber, leaving with Roman steel, salt, and silver. Some wore togas as signs of alliance, their sons serving as hostages in Roman camps, learning Latin and the ways of empire. To Augustus and Tiberius, this was the dream, an enemy softened not by endless war, but by the subtle chains of economy and culture. But such chains cut both ways. For many tribes, these new markets and roads were not symbols of prosperity but reminders of subjugation. The presence of Roman garrisons and tax officials disrupted traditional economies built on kinship and honor. A chieftain who once earned prestige by raiding could not easily replace that glory with coins from Roman merchants. Gifts that once bound clans together were now rivaled by Roman luxuries, destabilizing fragile tribal balances. Even alliances born of necessity bred resentment. The Sicambri, once resettled into Roman lands, remembered the humiliation of their forced migration. The Cherusci, seemingly compliant, hid their bitterness beneath oaths of loyalty. To them, Roman markets were not opportunities but threats, the slow erosion of their independence. Tiberius' relentless fort building only deepened the unease. Each new fortress, Anrepin, Marktbreit, Carnuntum, was a scar on the land, a reminder that Rome did not come to visit but to stay. For Roman veterans, these posts offered stability, farmland, and the promise of retirement. For the tribes, they were watchtowers of occupation. The paradox was clear: the more Rome extended the gifts of civilization, the more it provoked defiance.
Been here too long.
Roads allowed legions to march swiftly, but they also gave rebels paths to burn. Markets enriched some, but they exposed divisions between chiefs who profited and warriors who seethed. Even the presence of Roman religion, altars to Jupiter, sacrifices to Mars, was seen as an intrusion into sacred groves and ancestral rites. To Augustus in distant Rome, the reports must have seemed
We
reassuring,
require
commerce
your contribution
growing,
to the
legions
Empire.
victorious, tribes submitting. But beneath the numbers and proclamations lay something more dangerous, resentment simmering into rage. Germania had not been pacified, only pressured.
The time for talk is
The
over.
facade of cooperation
We must
masked an
resist.
undercurrent of fury, waiting for the right moment, the right leader, to explode. And as Rome congratulated itself on its triumphs, the empire failed to notice that its very successes were
Message is
planting the
urgent,
seeds
scribe.
of future
From the
catastrophe.
eastern frontier.
I understand. Let
Roads,
me see it.
markets, and garrisons might have bound Germania to Rome, but they also gave its tribes a common enemy, a reason to unite against the empire. For the moment, Augustus could celebrate the apparent calm. Yet the truth was clear to anyone who looked beyond the marble of Rome or the banners of the legions. The frontier was not a wall of strength but a fault line, ready to break. And soon, when Rome's attention was pulled elsewhere, the fracture would come. Even as Tiberius pushed deeper into Germania, Augustus' empire was about to face a crisis from another quarter altogether, one that would dwarf tribal uprisings and border skirmishes. To the south, in the rugged provinces of Illyricum and Dalmatia, tension had been quietly building for years, fed by abuses, taxation, and the unyielding weight of Roman rule. What was about to erupt would be remembered by
Time for
Romans
talk is over.
themselves as
We
their
must
greatest
act.
threat
I
since
agree.
Hannibal.
We cannot endure
The
this
seeds
any
of
longer.
rebellion were many. Rome had long
Reports of
conscripted men
raids
from
and
the Balkan
uprisings in the
highlands,
eastern
drawing
provinces
on
are
their
concerned.
reputation as hardy warriors. These recruits filled auxiliary ranks, fighting in distant campaigns for an empire
The
that gave them
message
little
must
in
reach the
return.
capital by dawn.
Yet conscription was resented, especially when it became relentless. Families were left without fathers and sons, villages drained of their strongest men. Taxation, too, weighed heavily. Roman officials demanded levies in coin, ignoring the local traditions of barter and tribute in kind. To mountain communities unaccustomed to such demands, coinage was not a convenience but a burden, forcing them into markets where Roman merchants dictated value.
They come
Worse
again with
still,
their demands,
governors often
taking
abused
our
their
sons,
authority,
our
squeezing
future.
provincials for personal
What
enrichment.
choice do we have now?
In Rome, such corruption was
Hand over
whispered
your
about with
coins.
disgust. In the provinces, it was lived reality. By 6 CE, the pot boiled over. Discontent that had long smoldered in Illyricum and Dalmatia now burst into flame.
We will resist these abuses.
Villages and
We must stand
tribes,
strong
once
against them.
divided by geography and rivalry, found common cause in rebellion. Leaders emerged who understood not only
We
the
received more
grievances
reports
but
of
the
raids.
opportunity. Rome
Another
was
uprising in
distracted.
the north.
Its armies were stretched thin, legions in Germania, garrisons in Judea, detachments on the Parthian frontier. The empire had never been larger, but never so overextended. Reports reached Augustus in fragments, raids on Roman outposts, tax collectors slain, whole regions in open defiance. What began as scattered uprisings rapidly coalesced into a full-scale revolt. Some sources claim as many as 800,000 rebels eventually took up arms, a number perhaps inflated by Roman chroniclers, yet revealing the scale of fear the revolt inspired.
We cannot give them
For
more.
Augustus, the timing was disastrous.
We have no choice.
The
It is
illusion
law.
of stability he had so carefully
levy,
staged,
now.
through temples, titles, and triumphs, was now cracking. Germania was restless, Armenia uncertain, Judea simmering. And now, in the Balkans, a war was emerging that would require not just punitive expeditions but a massive, sustained
Northern
campaign.
provinces report increased raiding.
It was into this storm that
aware.
Tiberius would once again be
Glory
hurled.
of Rome.
The man who had once fled to Rhodes now found himself indispensable, the only commander capable of holding together a war on multiple fronts. The Illyrian revolt would test not only his endurance but Rome's very capacity to govern its sprawling dominion. The senators in Rome would later shudder to recall these years, calling the Illyrian uprising the greatest danger since Hannibal crossed the Alps. And though Augustus remained the figurehead of empire, the struggle would reveal the truth. Rome's fate now rested squarely on Tiberius' shoulders. The Twilight of Augustus was no longer a matter of succession ceremonies or temple dedications. It was a matter of survival. The storm had broken, and the empire would have to weather it, or fracture. The empire Augustus had carved from decades of war now stood vast, glittering, yet fragile. In his final years, he lived not as a conqueror but as a man haunted by the choices of succession, by the failures and losses that had hollowed his dynasty.
It is urgent.
The Twilight of Augustus is best seen not through campaigns alone but through the portraits of those who surrounded him, each a reflection of Rome's fortune and Rome's peril. Tiberius, his reluctant heir, embodied both necessity and unease. A commander of rare discipline, he subdued Germania step by step, held the Rhine with patience, and, when Illyricum exploded into revolt, bore the burden with iron will. Yet in Rome, he remained unloved, a figure of suspicion, dour and unyielding. His brilliance lay not in charisma but in endurance, a soldier suited for empire's grind, not its theater. Augustus could adopt him, could raise him up, but he could never make the people adore him. Germanicus, the young hope bound into the succession through adoption, was the bright contrast. Beloved by soldiers, admired by the people, he seemed to carry the promise of a new golden heir. His name itself tied him to the frontier, to victories yet to be won. But in Augustus' lifetime, he remained a figure of potential, not fulfillment, a reminder that succession was always tomorrow's gamble, never today's certainty. Then there were the grandsons, Lucius and Gaius, whose lives ended before their stories truly began. To the Roman people, they were martyrs of expectation, boys who had been paraded as heirs only to be laid to rest in the mausoleum of Augustus. Their silver-gilt arms in the Curia Julia stood as relics of dreams that never ripened. Their deaths were not just personal tragedies, they were symbols of how precarious Rome's dynasty truly was. Varus, meanwhile, cast a long shadow. His suppression of Judea had been brutal but effective, yet his reputation for severity, for cruelty wrapped in arrogance, foreshadowed darker days. The same man who crucified thousands in Judea would soon march into Germania and vanish with 3 legions in the forests of Teutoburg. In him we glimpse the danger of commanders who mistake fear for loyalty. Quirinius, the steady legate, emerges as another figure of this age, capable, practical, but also symbolic of Rome's intrusion into local lives. His census in Syria, conducted after Augustus' death, would spark new resentment, remembered centuries later in Christian Gospels as a moment of upheaval. Even the most efficient administrators left trails of unrest in their wake. And Augustus himself? His portrait in these years is not marble perfection but weary flesh. The man who had outlasted rivals, built cities, and pacified provinces found himself surrounded by ghosts. Agrippa, Maecenas, Drusus, Lucius, Gaius, all gone. His triumphs, though real, were shadowed by absence. He closed the doors of Janus, but peace was an illusion. He staged ceremonies of succession, but heirs crumbled in the face of time. The themes of his twilight are clear. Empire was not sustained by conquest alone but by succession, and succession was always uncertain. Logistics, discipline, and spectacle could extend Rome's reach, but mortality was a foe no emperor could defeat. Augustus discovered that his greatest war was not against Parthia, nor Germania, nor Judea, it was against the fragility of dynastic inheritance. As the Illyrian storm gathered, Augustus' final lesson became unmistakable: empire was a choreography of appearances, temples, titles, closed doors, grandsons paraded in togas. Yet beneath the choreography lay the grind of logistics, the brutality of crucifixions, the slow bleed of rebellion, and the constant threat of collapse. Rome endured, not because Augustus found the perfect heir, but because the machinery of empire proved stronger than the flesh of dynasties. Still, for Augustus, the question of succession remained a wound that never healed. He had built a world of marble, but its foundations trembled on sand. As his reign waned, the empire stood secure in appearance, fragile in truth. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, so carefully crafted, had survived this far. But history was already whispering of disasters yet to come, storms in Germania, betrayals in courts, poison in cups. The age of Augustus was fading, and with it, the certainty of peace.